Hello, everyone. My name is Anastasia Tabasco-Flores, and I will be working through this capstone project to hopefully find some trends and to model some predictions around student graduation for particularly four-year post-secondary programs and the implications on how that could create or stifle generational wealth. Now, there are a lot of different key points on here, so I'll give you all a minute to take a look at the overview. And the goal of this work in progress conversation, really, I'm going to be focusing a lot of my time on thinking through, setting up the context so I can think through a little bit more what methods and tools will be the most useful in achieving this goal. So my goals for this project are intentional in trying to find different ways to support students and families in making informed decisions about their post-secondary planning. Some of you may know I currently work as a college and career counselor in a high school in a predominantly Black and brown school that serves low-income families and some middle-income families. And throughout my years doing this work, I have seen that there are a lot of things that are happening outside of our control in terms of federal policy around institutions in higher ed and them finding ways to support students in persisting, and also a lot of changes around how financial aid is dealt with and looked at. And my hope is that as I take a look through a lot of this data, is to find ways and see if there are different trends among different institutions, and see if there are ways to improve the process of making a more informed decision, particularly around financial need, to make sure that my students will be supported to complete that four-year degree. And then, of course, what helps one group of people will hopefully help a larger group of people as well. So I'm very excited to be attempting to jump into this data and into this capstone. Before we jump into some of the nitty-gritty, I do want to just get everybody on the same page on what language definitions I'll be using. I think that there's been a lot of loose conversation about this, and I want to be very clear about what I'm talking about. So you know when I use these terms, what I'm speaking about throughout the data sets in particular. So graduation rates is, just as it seems, a student who graduates, in this case, within 6 years of their first enrollment in a post-secondary program, and that is for the completion of a bachelor's degree. So I will not be addressing associate's degrees. I will not be addressing work certificates. I will not be addressing master's. This is specifically bachelor's degrees in this example. Financial aid. When I speak about financial aid generally, I'm speaking about the combination of scholarships, grants, and student loans that a student receives while attending a post-secondary institution. So whenever I say financial aid award, I mean the amount of scholarships, grants, and student loans, whether that's institutional or federal, a student receives. Institution type, I think this one is going to be particularly important. There are public, private, and for-profit institutions, and they are all very different ballgames. Public, they rely on tuition, but also federal and state government funding. Private are typically nonprofit programs that rely on tuition and private endowments. And for-profit institutions rely on tuition and generate funds for investors, stockholders, and even a parent company. Some for-profit institutions are actually owned by a business. So that is also going to be a very important thing to keep in mind as we look through this. And then, of course, financial need met. I we'll talk a little bit more how this came up shortly, but I did want to name in terms of a definition. Every college has a percentage of financial need that they meet. That is the percent of funding of their financial aid awards, so scholarships, grants, and student loans, that a student will receive from each college. Now, you're probably wondering, well, how will a college even know how much a family needs? And that's determined of one of two ways, and possibly both. Most, if not all, institutions accept the FAFSA, which is a federal application for aid. And that tells you whether or not a student is eligible for state and federal grants and scholarships, and give students access to federal student loan money if they choose to take it out. In addition, some colleges are like, okay, the FAFSA is cool, but I also want you to complete the CSS profile, which is sponsored by the College Board. Historically, that is actually something that was only used for international students, but as endowments have gotten bigger, particularly at highly selective institutions. So I live in the Northeast, so schools like Smith College, Yale, Trinity College, Tufts University, they use the CSS profile, which is an additional institutional application for aid. So at one of those institutions, in order to receive scholarships from the school itself, the CSS profile must be filled out. Now, let's talk a little bit about the data itself. The data is large. I will show you the observation sizes in just a bit, but the two main sources that I found, the majority data that I've used, and I might think about using information from the census. It might not be necessary, but I'm contemplating it. So that is something I could use feedback on as you guys hear more about what this will look like. And particularly, I use the National Center for Educational Statistics. And the two reports that I'm focusing on are the 6-year graduation rate for students and the percentage of financial aid offered by each institution. And while that was a great base for information, it didn't give me some of the other key information types that I've been looking for. So that information had to be pulled through the College Board, and things like whether or not it was public or private, the percentage of need met, and also a couple other considerations was only available through the College Board. So that is something that I actually had to compile the two things together. And particularly with the larger two data sets, and it was two very large ones. One of them I feel like I've cleaned up pretty successfully, and that is the data set with the 6-year graduation rate. There are still a lot of observations. There's almost 100,000 observations, and there are 20 features. Half are categorical, the other are quantitative. So the half that are categorical are things like, what type of institution is it, private or public? What is the name of the institution? What is their college CEEB code? And then I have the quantitative numbers are all numbers for different years from like 2009 to about 2019. The school year ends in 2020, so it'll say 2020. But those are the values that I have in there. Even though there's a ton of observations here, the actual number of unique institutions in that 93,000 was 1781. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that even though there are a ton of observations, that the actual participating institutions we're going to look at are at about just short of 1,800. which is still a good amount. It's still a good amount. The percentage of financial need offered, this one has been much tougher to clean up. With this reporting system, all of the information that I have has been self-reported from the institutions. So some institutions did not report every single year. So I'm still working through cleaning that out and trying to get down to that, 781 schools. And even that might reduce a little bit further if I feel like I have too much null space in there. I'm probably going to end up taking out those institutions because I do worry how that's going to skew the data. And then again, for categorical, it's a lot of the same things that we're going to see from the 6-year grad rate. And then the quantitative are numbers or percentages of aid given for different years as well. And it will be the same years as the 6-year grad rate from above. So we're going to try to look at a 10-year window from about 2009 to 2020 and finding out what trends might be working in there. That's the hope. Now, I do think it's important because I think to talk about this, collecting this data. And I have a couple reasons why. It was very tough to get access to even this much data. Post-secondary institutions are very secretive about what they report and how they report it out. And even as I was looking through like the federal Department of Education, as I was looking through College Board, as I was looking through all of federal student aid website, they do not want to give this up. They like to give aggregate data. They love to give summary data. They do not love to give the line by line details that I need to complete this project. So some of it actually, particularly the items through College Board, had to be manually compiled into the data that I had pulled from the National Center for Education Statistics, because it just doesn't exist anywhere else. And from what I've seen, you have to like go through the federal government to request some of those things. And the way things have been moving with the pandemic, I was not hopeful that I would get it anytime soon. So I just, did the thing and put everything together. So hopefully we'll see how this comes out. And I've talked about a little bit about a couple of things, but I will come back to this later. And I do want to name that not only as a counselor, but as a person with family members in college, it is so alarming to me that we do not have access to this information to make informed decisions for ourselves about what is financially feasible around post-secondary education. I just, it has been so difficult to find these things. And I will be, curious to see how this capstone comes together, because I think that's kind of a big deal. That's kind of a big deal to not be able to access any of the actual raw data from institutions. It kind of makes you wonder, why don't they give it out? But we'll see with some trends. Maybe we can get an idea as to a couple of the reasons why. And then the last thing I did want to mention that I thought was important is that some institutions on here do have campuses in more than one place and in more than one state. Each campus does have its own respective unique ID. So some schools will separate them out. However, this is dependent on the colleges reporting the information accurately in the first place. So as you can imagine, it's not going to be perfect. And I want to name that upfront because I'm not sure on what the implications will be on the trends of the data. So now that we have an idea what's going on, I did want to come back and go a little bit deeper into some of the questions that I'm thinking about as I'm working through this capstone throughout the semester. And one of the biggest challenges that I am working through grappling What are the best ways to model this prediction? We want to know the graduation rates for students depending on different institution types. Do students typically do better at public versus private? That's one example. I'd be curious to see if geography impacts graduation rates. Do students, let's say in Florida, do better, have a higher percentage of graduating than students maybe in California? Does gender play a role in this? Does ethnicity play a role in this? And I'm also incredibly curious on if the institution financial need met percentage also impacts this. So in my experience, I have seen a student who might go to Yale and their need met was determined by the federal government to be 0. So Yale is giving them a ton of scholarships, the student gets access to federal grant money, and the student gets access to student loans, and they probably don't have a very large out-of-pocket expense. Is a student who attends a private school with a need met that high going to be more successful than a student who attends a non-competitive private school? For example, Albertus Magnus is down the street from Yale. I'm curious if that could also have an impact on student graduation as well. Now, the final question I have, the financial need met versus the data that was provided about how much money is awarded in financial aid. Those two data sets were two very different ballgames. And I'm actually wondering if I need that second data set at all, particularly with how large it is, particularly with how much mess is in there, how much has to get cleaned out. I actually wonder whether I need that or if I can find solid trends without it. I'm actually hoping I can without it, just because I don't know if what information was provided is, one, accurate enough, and two, if it's really gonna correlate at all. Never mind if there is a relationship that includes causation, never mind correlation. So that last question, I'm a little iffy on whether or not that's going to get tackled. I might be a little over ambitious, but I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on that. And another big question that I'm working through and want to work through before our next connection together is supervised or unsupervised learning methods going to give the best prediction for graduation? Let me go to the next one. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So I've been spending the majority of my time cleaning out the data and just like trying to make sure it makes sense as it pops up, because there's so much going on in it with as many observations as there are. Now that I have the 6-year grad rate one cleaned up, I'm pretty confident that a lot of these things will come together, but I'm curious and would love your feedback on a couple thoughts on methods. I think from the most basic standpoint, what will be helpful in this final project will be to show some historical trends. I'm thinking it could be histograms, line graphs, just to see, are the graduation rates going up and down? Are they staying stagnant? What does that look like from a very basic view? And then I would love to dive deeper and say, okay, now that we have this basic view, in terms of prediction, based on what we have, what is the best method to check this out? A couple things that popped up for me that I'd be curious to get your thoughts about would be KNN clustering. I think that could be helpful in maybe 1 or 2 categorical variables, and PCA as well. I do worry a little bit because there's so many categorical features that we are going to see in there that might not be as helpful as I would hope. I actually really am excited to try some regression trees. I think that could be particularly helpful. Like, for example, if we are seeing a bunch of graduation rates that are above 70%, do we see a lot of that happening in the same state? Do we tend to see females over males tend to have that higher graduation rate? And I think regression trees could be really helpful for this project in particular. And because there are so many high dimensions, I also wonder if support vector machines would be useful. I did toss around neural networks a little bit, but I wonder if support vector machines will be a little more efficient in terms of the coding itself. So that's something that has come to mind for me. And the flip side of that is maybe it would be helpful to use some of the simpler methods, or maybe even like a regression tree to look at national trends, and then kind of dive in a little deeper with the PCA or the KNN clustering in a specific state. I say that because if it's not geography, if it's something else, if it's the institution type, if it's gender, are we able to get a representative sample using one state that is not going to be so heavy in so many observations, and that I can come up with like a good, efficient prediction using that one state's data? That is something that I wonder if that would be helpful. But I would love for you guys to tell me if you think that actually is going to make my life harder. And if I should stick with more national trends as well. So these are all the things that are coming up for me as I'm diving into this weekend. And yeah, so there's going to be a lot of data that's going to go in here. There's going to be a lot of reflection. Still working through a lot of this stuff right now. However, I would love to get your input on what you think could be a solid and efficient method to kind of start with as I dive into these things. And I will also leave a quick snapshot at the top of what the data set looks like for you all, so that way you can see exactly what we're dealing with, particularly for the 6-year graduation rate data set. I'm going to get that to everybody so you can see exactly what we're looking at, because if you're anything like me, you're a visual learner. But thank you all so much. I appreciate your input, and I hope you all have a great day. See you soon.